Welcome to Come Follow Me, a doctrinal and historical context video for Doctrine and Covenants sections 125 through 128. To begin with, I want you to notice this graphic and the color scheme on it. You can see that according to the graph, a certain number of sections were done before 1831, and then there's another color, a purplish color, for 1831 to 39, and then a rose color for 1840 to 1844. And there are very, very few sections in this area. So you have to question why. Well, the answer is quite simple. Joseph was involved in receiving revelation about the temple. And as such, these revelations are not recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants. So it was an interesting insight that I received while I was listening to several podcasts this week. Joseph Smith was extremely busy in the Nauvoo period in receiving revelation. It just wasn't posted in the Doctrine and Covenants. You can see also that another long period of time has elapsed from section 124 that we did last week. 125 through 128 appear over almost a 2-year period of time. So let's jump into section 125. Here's some background for you. After Governor Boggs issued the executive order to remove all members of the church from the state of Missouri in October of 1838, thousands of members of the church fled Missouri to Iowa or Illinois. The prophet arranged to buy about 700 acres of land in Commerce, and then later renamed that Nauvoo, but nearly 18,000 acres in Iowa, across from where Nauvoo was going to be. Branches of the church were eventually established in Iowa. One of the cities there was named Zarahemla, and another named Nashville, not to be confused with Tennessee. The name Zarahemla didn't stick for very long. After the members of the church were chased out of the Nauvoo area, they resumed the name of Montrose. During a church conference held in 1839, the Iowa stake was created, and then in March of 1841, the prophet received the revelation that we now know as Doctrine and Covenants, section 125. The principal places of gathering in Iowa territory were named as Zarahemla and Nashville. In August of 1841, the Iowa stake was changed to the Zarahemla stake. However, that only stayed for a short time because members of the church were needed to help build the Nauvoo temple. The Zarahemla stake was dissolved in January 1841 as so many members of the church moved from the Iowa territory to Nauvoo. You may question why 18,000 acres were purchased in Iowa. They were trying to look ahead. It was possible to purchase land in Iowa, which was an unorganized territory, for $2 an acre. Joseph had heard about this while he was in Liberty Jail, and so he had issued instructions to buy this land at $2 an acre. It was also possible to purchase without a down payment and to defer the payments over 20 years. And so for $36,000, they were able to buy 18,000 acres. He was doing this so that when the saints gathered, they would be able to afford to purchase land near where the temple was going to be built. So here we have section 125, and it just simply answers the question, what is the will of the Lord concerning the saints in the Iowa territory? And then the Lord gives the response about Zarahemla and Nashville. We have the following from Ezra Taft Benson. As the church grows, it's very important that we build solidly and well, and that our prospective stakes have the basic ingredients that are necessary for success, and that existing stakes work tirelessly for full stakehood in the sense of spiritual achievements. These stakes are to be the gathering spots for the Zion of today, and they need to be spiritual sanctuaries and to be self-sufficient in as many ways as possible. The stakes and districts of Zion are symbolic of the holy places spoken of by the Lord, where his saints are to be gathered in the last days as a refuge for the storm. The church is very, very careful about organizing stakes and how they do it. They want to make sure that they're as self-sufficient as possible and that they can be maintained. Let's move on to section 126. I want to talk about Brigham Young a little bit first because this section pertains to him. Brigham joined the church in 1832. His first wife, Miriam, died of consumption, what we would call tuberculosis today, leaving Brigham with two young daughters. Violet, I'm using the English pronunciation here. I know a lot of people call her Violet, but I'm going to call her Violet. Violet Kimball, who was the wife of Heber, took his daughters in while Brigham and Heber went about preaching the gospel. Brigham then married Mary Ann Angel in 1834. Brigham later wrote that Mary Ann took charge of my children, kept my house, and labored faithfully for the interest of my family and the kingdom. That doesn't say a lot about Mary Ann. She had a solid testimony of the gospel and went through a lot of hardships while Brigham was out and about doing his missionary work. We'll talk a little bit more about her later. Brigham had been transformed by joining the church, and he had this intense desire to proclaim the gospel. He said, I wanted to thunder and roar out the gospel to the nations. It burned in my bones like fire pent up. Although this required a lot of travel, often with poverty, sickness, and harsh weather, Brigham went very willingly. It has never entered into my heart, he said, from the first day I was called to preach the gospel to the last, when the Lord said, go and leave your family, to offer the least objection. Well, Mary Ann, his wife, didn't object either, even though Brigham was gone for half of their first 5 years that they were together. He left for 4 months during Zion's camp, and he made it home just in time for the birth of their first child. In 1835, as an apostle, he was gone for 5 months. Most of 1836 was spent working on the temple. He served 2 missions in 1837. When Brigham returned in the fall of 1837, he found Kirkland in a turmoil. His loyalty to Joseph Smith made him a target for opponents of the church. In December, he had to flee for his life and was forced to leave his family behind. Mary Ann and the children were terrorized by apostates who frequently came to search her property and bombarded her with threats and vile language, frightening her to the point of damaging her health. When Mary Ann finally joined Brigham in far west Missouri in the spring of 1838, he was shocked to see her condition, and he said to her, you look as if you're almost in your grave. Not something I would ever venture to say to my spouse. Shortly after Brigham's family arrived, Joseph Smith received an unpublished revelation instructing Brigham that he was not to leave his family again until they were amply provided for. But a revelation to the Quorum of the 12 in July, now in the Doctrine and Covenants 118, indicated how short that respite was. In 9 months, the 12 were to depart on a mission to Great Britain, taken from far west. You remember that special ops mission where they had to sneak into Missouri and then set off on their mission. Between July 1838 and April 1839, the saints were driven out of Missouri. Mary Ann recalled that by the time they reached the safety of Illinois, she had kept house in 11 different places within 3 months. And of course, she was also pregnant. While the saints were gathering to Nauvoo, the young stayed in Montrose across the Mississippi. On the 2nd of July, 1839, the 12 met with the First Presidency at the home of Brigham Young. The Presidency laid their hands upon the heads of several present, including Mary Ann, to bless them and their families before they left to preach the gospel. The brethren were promised that they would return to their families and that they would convert many souls. 2 months later, on September the 14th, Brigham bade farewell to Mary Ann and set out on his mission to England. It would be hard to imagine worse circumstances. We were in the depths of poverty, caused by being driven from Missouri, where we had left everything. His wardrobe had not much of a ministerial appearance. His cap was made out of a pair of old pants, and a small quilt with a comforter running through it served as his overcoat. Like many of the saints at the time, he was suffering from malaria and shaking with fever. His health was so bad that, as he recalled, I was unable to walk without assistance. I was helped to the edge of the Mississippi and carried across. Nevertheless, he was determined to go to England or die trying. Brigham was not the only one suffering. Mary Ann had just given birth 10 days earlier. The family now consisted of 7 children, and they were all sick and unable to wait upon each other. Nevertheless, she crossed the river from Iowa to Illinois so she could bid her husband a final farewell. As Brigham and an equally sick Heber pulled away from the Nauvoo home, Brigham joined his friend in feebly standing up in the wagon in which they were riding to shout "Hurrah for Israel" 3 times. 2 months after Brigham left, the family was grappling with malaria and they ran out of food. Mary Ann was forced out of her room in Montrose and took up residence in a horse stable. She made a meager living sewing and washing clothes. She was eventually given a lot in Nauvoo and built a cabin there by herself. Her nephew later recalled it was simply the body of a house, with blankets hung over the doors and windows to keep out the elements. She didn't have the skills to complete the windows and the doors, so she hung fabric there to give her some illusion of security. Upon returning to Nauvoo in July 1841, after a 22-month absence, Brigham learned just how impoverished Mary Ann and the children had been. He set to work immediately to improve the situation. And when not at the call of Brother Joseph in the service of the church, he spent his time draining, fencing, and cultivating his lot, building a temporary shed for my cow, chinking and otherwise finishing my house. At the same time, he began work on a red brick home that still stands in Nauvoo, although he wasn't able to move his family into it until mid-1843. If you want to know a little bit more about Mary Ann, and I would recommend that you read this article that was written by Rex Jensen on the church website. I printed the link underneath in red. So here's the actual revelation, all that for these 3 lines. Dear and well-beloved Brigham, verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Brigham, it is no more required at your hand to leave your family as in times of past, for your offering is acceptable to me. I have seen your labor and toil in journeyings for my name. I therefore command you to send my word abroad, and take especial care of your family from this time henceforth and forever. You can see here that Brigham is relieved of his responsibility to travel. He was the president of the Quorum of the 12. He was instead to send the brethren out and to stay in Nauvoo and to take care of his family. It's also interesting to note that we're nearing the end of the Doctrine and Covenants. I'm not giving away anything here by telling you that Joseph Smith will be killed shortly. And as such, it was important for Brigham, who would then be the head of the church, to get as much training and as much time in with Joseph as possible before that horrible event comes to pass. Most importantly, though, I think it was so that he could take care of his family. We have this from the First Presidency letter dated 1999. We call upon parents to devote their best efforts to the teaching and rearing of their children in gospel principles which will keep them close to the church. The home is the basis of a righteous life, and no other instrumentality can take its place or fulfill its essential functions in carrying forward this God-given responsibility. We counsel parents and children to give highest priority to family prayer, family home evening, gospel study and instruction, and wholesome family activities. However worthy and appropriate other demands or activities may be, they must not be permitted to displace the divinely appointed duties that only parents and families can adequately perform. Another way of saying this is a very famous saying from Stephen Covey, who said, "The enemy of best is good." Sometimes we get so wrapped up in doing good things, we must never forget to do the best things, and that has to do with our families. Doctrine and Covenants 127. The prophet's first public teaching about the doctrine of baptisms for the dead occurred as he preached at a funeral for Brother Seymour Brunson, who we talked about last week, who was a member of the Nauvoo High Council and a bodyguard of the prophet, and that happened in 1840. Soon afterwards, church members began performing baptisms for the dead in the Mississippi River. 4 months later, the prophet announced the doctrine in a letter to members of the quorum who were serving missions in Great Britain. This is a quote from Joseph. "The saints have the privilege of being baptized for those of their relatives who are dead, who they feel to believe would have embraced the gospel if they had been privileged with hearing it, and who have received the gospel in the Spirit through the instrumentality of those who may have been commissioned to preach to them while in prison." Before the baptistry in the Nauvoo temple was complete, the Lord permitted the saints to temporarily perform baptisms in places other than the temple, explaining, "This ordinance belongeth to my house, and cannot be acceptable to me only in the days of your poverty, wherein you are not able to build a house unto me. I grant unto you a sufficient time to build a house unto me, and during this time your baptism shall be acceptable unto me. By the end of November 1841, a large wooden baptismal font was prepared in the basement of the Nauvoo Temple and enclosed in a temporary clapboard building within the construction of the actual walls and before the temple was completed. In May 1842, the former Governor Boggs of Missouri, who had issued the extermination order, was wounded in an assassination attempt. Missouri authorities accused the prophet Joseph of helping plan the attack. Officials from both Missouri and Illinois tried to arrest the prophet, who was living in Nauvoo at the time, and tried to take him back to Missouri for trial. Knowing that if he returned to Missouri he would likely be killed, the prophet was in and out of hiding from August 42 through December 42 to avoid being arrested. He had very good reason that if he was taken to Missouri he would be killed. Remember, many of the higher-ups in Missouri were embarrassed that they had Joseph in jail without any substantial evidence for their guilt. And with public opinion turning against them, they had instructed the sheriff who was transporting them to a new venue to let him go. In fact, they encouraged them, according to Hiram. And that's how the other brethren were able to escape. Well, what I didn't tell you at that time, and which what I have subsequently determined, is that they held accountable two of the senior people, the sheriff and his assistant at that time, for having let them go. While they publicly proclaimed that they never had a hand in letting them go, one of them was taken by the mob and lynched and ridden on a rail out of town, which ultimately killed him. So Joseph was serious when he said that he feared for his life. On September the 1st, Joseph Smith worked in a room above the red brick store where they often conducted the church business as well as at his home. And sometime during that day, the prophet wrote a letter containing instruction from members of the church letting them know that he was planning to go into hiding and instructing them regarding the ordinance of proxy baptism. 2 days later, he was forced to hide once more. On September 4th, the letter was read aloud to the church members who were gathered at an outdoor meeting grove near the Nauvoo Temple. The contents of this letter are recorded in what we now call Doctrine and Covenants, section 127. I want to say a few words here about Orrin Porter Rockwell. He was quite a colorful character, and there have been a lot of stories with reference to Porter. This article from the Church History Library answers the top 5 questions about Orrin, and I recommend you read them because they're very interesting. The reason I bring up Porter is that when the Missourians claimed Joseph Smith had attempted to kill Boggs, he was verifiably not in Missouri. He was in Nauvoo with thousands of witnesses. And so they assumed that he had instructed Porter to do the evil deed. And so as a result, an arrest warrant was also issued at that time for Orrin. Orrin was later captured as he was returning to Nauvoo and passing through Missouri at the time. There are a lot of stories that are very interesting. One of them, which I find very amusing, the story about his own defense, where they asked him directly, did you attempt to kill the former Governor Boggs? And he looked at them and he said something to the effect that, he's still alive, isn't he? Well, then it wasn't me. I thought that was very amusing. It's also interesting to note that Orrin was a pacifist for most of his beginning years, and he didn't become a bodyguard and become an expert with firearms until after he was beaten in Missouri and kicked out of the state. And then he decided that it would be okay for him to defend himself and those who were around him, and so he became an expert. Section 127 is very interesting. If you read verse 2, as for the perils which I am called to pass through, they seem but a small thing to me, as the envy and wrath of man have been my common lot all the days of my life. For what cause it seems mysterious, unless I was ordained from the foundation of the world for some good end or bad, as you may choose to call it. Judge ye for yourself. God knoweth all these things, whether it be good or bad. But nevertheless, deep water is what I am wont to swim in. It all has become a second nature to me. I feel like Paul to glory in tribulation. From the time that he's 14, throughout all of his life, he was harassed, and it just became almost second nature to him. From Elder Hales, we have the following. There is meaning and purpose in our earthly challenges. Consider the prophet Joseph. Throughout his life, he faced daunting opposition, illness, accident, poverty, misunderstanding, false accusations, and even persecution. One might be tempted to ask, why didn't the Lord protect his prophet from such obstacles, provide him with unlimited resources, and stop up the mouths of his accuser? The answer is, each of us must go through certain experiences to become more like our Savior. In the school of mortality, the tutor is often pain and tribulation, but the lessons are meant to refine and bless us and strengthen us, not to destroy us. From Howard W. Hunter, we have the following. It should be no surprise to us that the Lord does desire that his people be a temple-motivated people. I repeat what I have said before. It would please the Lord for every adult member to be worthy of and to carry a current temple recommend, even if proximity to a temple does not allow immediate or frequent use of it. The things that we must do and not do to be worthy of a temple recommend are the very things that ensure we will be happy as individuals and as family. So you can see, again in section 127, verse 4, that the Lord instructs them to let the work of the temple continue and not cease, and that they should be diligent and patient and redouble their efforts, even if there is persecution. Verses 5 through 7. And again I give you a word in relation to the baptisms for your dead. For thus saith the Lord, when any of you are baptized for your dead, let there be a recorder, and let him be eyewitness of your baptisms, that in all your recordings it may be recorded in heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth may be bound in heaven. You can see here that after the kind of helter-skelter method in which people ran to the Mississippi and were baptized, as Joseph thought on these things, he realized that there needed to be a recorder, that somebody needed to record all that was going on so that it could be recorded in heaven. He also said, I am about to restore many things to the earth pertaining to the priesthood. Let all your records be had in order, that they may be in the archives of my holy temple. From Joseph Smith we also have the following. In response to the Lord's command, the prophet and the saints moved forward as quickly as possible to begin building a house of the Lord. But the prophet realized that the construction would take years, and he knew that the saints needed the full blessings of the temple. So on May 4th, 1842, 4 months before section 127, even though the temple was not completed, Joseph Smith administered the endowment to a small group of faithful brethren. He knew that the temple would take a while, and he wanted to make sure that the knowledge that he had received, the revelations that he had received with regard to the temple, would not be lost. We have this from the Times and Seasons. Initially, before receiving additional instruction, and in their hurry to administer baptisms for their loved ones, the church members did not always accurately record their baptisms. In addition, proxies were sometimes baptized for people of the opposite gender, and the ordinance was often performed without witnesses. President Brigham Young explained, when an infinite being gives a law to his finite creatures, he has to descend to the capacity of those who receive the law. When the doctrine of baptism for the dead was first given, his church was in its infancy and was not capable of receiving all the knowledge of God in its highest degree. When the doctrine of baptism for the dead was first revealed, all the order of it was not made known. Afterwards it was made known that the records, clerks, and 1 or 2 witnesses were necessary, or else it would be of no value to the saints. The Lord has led this people all the while in this way, by giving them here a little and there a little. Thus he increases their wisdom, and he that receives a little and is thankful for that shall receive more and more. So let's move on to section 128. On September 3rd, 1842, the prophet was at his home with his family when he learned that sheriffs from Missouri and Illinois were approaching with the intent to arrest him. The prophet was able to slip away unnoticed and eventually made his way that evening to the home of Edward Hunter. And I want to speak a little bit here about how that was done. You remember the Nauvoo Charter that they received. Well, this enabled them to create laws for their own protection. They'd learned that in Missouri, the government often wasn't on their side. And so one of the laws they created was that prior to complying with any order, they had the right to check the validity of the order. So when the sheriffs came to arrest Joseph, the government of Nauvoo intervened and said, well, we want to check this. The sheriffs, not being lawyers, then had to go back and verify some things. And while that was happening, the prophet was able to escape. The following day, the prophet's letter dated September 1st was read aloud to the church members who were gathered in the outdoor meeting grove near the temple. On September 7th, while still at Brother Hunter's home, the prophet dictated a long epistle to the saints which he ordered to be read the next Sabbath. The contents of that letter are recorded in section 128. So sections 127 and 128 are actually letters that Joseph wrote to the church that were to be read in their meeting place, which was a grove. Interesting to note that for the last 5 years of his life, not one single church building was built exclusively for meetings and for worship. The temple was under construction, and so all of their focus was on building the temple. So the members of the church met in groves that were around Nauvoo, similar to this one. This place is the actual place in Nauvoo. The way this is laid out is a simulation. So this is a modern representation of what it might have looked like. Let's talk a little bit about baptism for the dead, or proxy baptism. We have this from President Joseph Fielding Smith. The Lord has placed the baptismal font in our temples below the foundation or the surface of the earth. You'll notice that all temples have baptismal fonts underneath the regular area. This is symbolic since the dead are in their graves and we are working for the dead when we are baptized for them. Moreover, baptism is also symbolic of death and resurrection. In fact, it is virtually a resurrection from the life of sin or from spiritual death to the life of spiritual life. Therefore, when the dead have had this ordinance performed in their behalf, they are considered to have been brought back into the presence of God, just as this doctrine is applied to the living. We have the following from Elder Quinton L. Cook from General Conference 2014. Think of those on the other side of the veil, waiting for the saving ordinances that would free them from the bondage of spirit prison. Prison is defined as a state of confinement or captivity. So in verse 15 we read, "And now, my dearly beloved brethren and sisters, let me assure you that these are the principles in relation to the dead and the living that cannot be lightly passed over as pertaining to our salvation. For their salvation is necessary and essential to our salvation, as Paul says concerning the fathers, that they without us cannot be made perfect, neither can we without our dead be made perfect." And according to Bruce R. McConkie, President Joseph Fielding Smith taught, there must be a family organization, a family unit, and each generation must be linked to the chain that goes before in order to bring perfection in the family organization. Thus, eventually, we will be one large family with Adam at the head, Michael, the archangel, presiding over his posterity. Now, when you read this scripture, when I read it the first time, I thought, well, okay, I understand why they need us. Because you need a body to be baptized, and it needs to be done in a temple. And if you're in spirit prison, you're hooped. Somebody has to do it for you. And that doctrine in itself turned Christianity on its head. I've talked before about holy envy, in particular from a high-ranking member of another church in Scandinavia who said he had holy envy, that he wished his church had this doctrine because it encompassed the love and concern and the kindness of a God who would take care of all of his children. Let's talk about the other side of it. Why do we need them? As I was studying this week, I found 3 reasons. The first one, imagine that you could only go through the temple once. I remember when I was 18, it's a long time ago, that when I went through the temple, if I had to appreciate and understand all that went on in a very symbolic temple ceremony in which I made serious covenants with God, there's no way that I could do it. And so I appreciate the fact that we can all go back unlimited numbers of times to do the work for those who are deceased, for the very selfish reason that it helps me also, because I'm able to renew and understand and have a continuous look at the covenants that we're making with God, that we can begin to understand, after we've been there many times, the real depth and the spiritual nature of these covenants that you're making. Number 2, would you be happy living in this great mansion in heaven without your families, without your mother and father, without your brothers and sisters, without your wife, without your children? Well, what about your parents, brothers and sisters, and their parents? Or what about your brother and sister's wives and their children? Would they feel comfortable? Would they feel happy living there? And so it goes on that we all need to be linked together. We don't want to be there by ourselves. And who are we going to leave out? It's a united thing where we're all linked together. The image that many genealogical societies represent with the tree and the roots and the branches is very apropos because we're linked together. The roots need the branches needs the roots. The third reason that I have contemplated this week is that we get help from the other side. Consider the following. This is from Theodore Tuttle in a talk that he gave in April of 1980. He's quoting Elder Widstow, who said, "I have the feeling that those who give themselves with all their might and main to this work receive help from the other side, and not merely in gathering genealogies. Whosoever seeks to help those on the other side receives help in return in all affairs of life." So in essence, what he's saying is that if you're having issues, difficulties, problems in this life, do your family history. Go to the temple. If you seek to help those who have gone before, they in turn will help you in whatever is happening in your life. Then we go to verse 24. "Behold, the great day of the Lord is at hand, and who can abide the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire, like fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. And he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness." So what exactly is this offering that he's talking about? Well, he explains it further. Now, I think a lot of people miss this when they're reading the scriptures. "Let us therefore, as a church and a people, and as Latter-day Saints, offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness, and let us present in his holy temple, when it is finished, a book containing the records of our dead, which shall be worthy of all acceptation." The Lord wants from us an offering of doing this work, this proxy work, for saving our families, for linking together the entire family, the family of Adam, all of our brothers and sisters, our parents, our children, and linking us all together to be returned to Heavenly Father. Else, as Malachi says, the whole world would be wasted. This book will be prepared using the records of names and ordinances in the Church Family Tree database. I am checking and adding records to this database because I want the names of all those I love to be in the book. Don't you? Family history is more than genealogy, rules, names, dates, and places. It is more than a focus on the past. Family history also includes the present as we create our own history. It includes the future as we shape future history through our descendants. Like partaking of the sacrament, attending meetings, reading the scriptures, and saying personal prayers, doing family history and temple work should be a regular part of our personal worship. The response of our youth and others to prophetic invitations has been inspiring and proves this work can and should be done by all members at any age. Doing the work now is much easier and limited only by the number of members who make this a priority. The work still takes time and sacrifice, but all can do it, and with the relative ease compared to just a few years ago. To assist members, the church has gathered records and provided tools so that much of the work can be done in our own homes, in our ward buildings, and the temple. Most obstacles have been removed. Whatever your past perception, it is different now. However, there is one obstacle the church cannot remove. It's an individual's hesitation to do the work. All it requires is a decision and a little effort. It does not require a large block of time. Just a little time on a consistent basis will yield the joy of the work. Make the decision to take a step, to learn and to ask others to help you. They will. The names you find and take to the temple will become the records for the book. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion on sections 125 to 128 this week. I know that for myself it's been very interesting to delve into it. I hope that you'll continue in your study this week and join us on Wednesday when we have an open discussion on things that have touched our hearts this week. Have a great week.